Next up, to tell you about role modeling open source best practices in firmware, are Mark Doran, Intel Fellow and President of the UEFI, and Stefano Citola, the Open Source Program Manager at Intel Corporation. Welcome. Thank you.
All right. Okay, that sounds boomy, so I'm guessing people in the corners of the room can hear me. They may not be listening over there, but they can definitely hear me, I'm sure. Okay, I'm going to talk as fast as possible to get out of the way and bring Stefano up because he has all the fun stuff to talk about. I want to talk to you today about some things that are changing in Intel's behavior with respect to the Tiano Core resident open source project, EDK2, because I think it might be interesting to this community. I know we're mostly focused in the forum around interfaces, and this is really a talk about what we're doing to manage the implementation, but since most of you have a hand in implementation, I suspect it's interesting. The obligatory who are we foil. My hat today, the reason I put this up here as much as anything is, usually when I'm up here talking at the Plugfest, I've got my UEFI forum hat on. Today, I'm firmly wearing an Intel hat, right? This is, separate those two things out in your mind. And Stefano is our community manager, and I am super excited that we actually have a community manager, something I've been asking for a long time, and something that I think we will get great benefit of, having somebody who can spend some real time thinking about how to help the community be more effective and grow over time. So I'm super glad he's here. That's why I want to talk quick and get him up here so that you can get the benefit of that too. Okay, so changes at Intel. For those who may not know this already, we have taken all of the people that you know as the UEFI core team, the server people and the client people, and smushed them into one organization. That's very similar to other things that we've done with OS work inside of Intel, aggregating all of the people that are in one discipline into one management chain and organization, so under one roof, as it says. As it turns out, there's also a next level up organization change as well, which looks just like Back to the Future. If you were working with us in circa 2000, there was a thing called the Core Software Division, which was composed of the Windows people, the open source people, Linux by any other name, and the firmware folks that were working on what was then EFI. Same old, now we have a group called the System Software Products Group, and it's that same set of people over again, only now just a little bit more sizable, I think. There are more of us. The real thing that matters about this to what we're talking about today is that having a single organization with a single decision maker gives us a great deal more agility. If I wanted to make a change in Intel's collective behavior or contributions to the open source project before, I had to go to 3 separate vice presidents with 3 separate set of corporate objectives. 2 of them were P&Ls, so you can imagine that their interest was entirely in what are you going to do for my product line and nothing else. And if you look at the model of life that we have inside of Intel today, it's a single decision maker, and it happens to be somebody that I've worked with for most of my career at Intel, who is surprisingly well aligned with the kinds of things that I think we need to be doing for the future of the betterment of the community. So we're better aligned, and we're able to make decisions and move much more quickly as a result. And I hope you'll see some evidence of that. So let me talk about motivation for a second. No big surprise. The very first thing that we need to do is to continue to deliver to the roadmap. Obviously, our main job in life, the reason that we get paid, is making sure that Intel Silicon gets enabled in the marketplace as quickly and efficiently as possible. So that remains the most important thing we do. The team that we have now is responsible for all of the client enabling, all of the server enabling, in addition to the core infrastructure, of course. We're interested in optimizing the path between what I think of as bookends. At one end of the timeline, we produce new silicon. At the other end of the timeline, that's interesting, we're talking about systems that people can go buy in the marketplace. There's some amount of firmware development, validation, delivery that needs to happen between those 2 bookends. As the ecosystem is organized today, our perception is that there's a certain amount of friction in there that we should be able to organize to keep to a minimum. And we're partly responsible for some of that, and we see some things in the ecosystem where we could collectively organize ourselves better to reduce that friction. And we're going to advocate for some of those kinds of changes as well. I will repeat something that I've said. Where's Gary? He could probably do this, this particular speech for me as well. Intel does not believe that firmware is a space where there is competitive advantage to be had, right? The fact that we invest all of this time, treasure, and energy in building the contributions that we have to the open source project is indicative of the fact that we think it's strategic enabling grease. Everybody's got to have it, right? You can't ship an IA machine without firmware on it in some way, shape, or form. But generally speaking, we're not getting paid gobs of money for interesting things we're doing in firmware. There just isn't the interest in the marketplace for that. Customers buying the machines at the end of the value chain are interested in the nice, Windows-based applications and Linux-based applications that they run on their systems, not how they, ideally under 2 seconds we spend in the firmware to boot the machine, goes about doing its business. And that sort of brings me to the do less, deliver more. We have been in the habit of thinking about all the code that we deliver for enabling as reference code. And we're going to continue to do that, but ideally what we want to do is do a better job of making that code more ready for product use. One of the friction things I talked about, right, duplicated work that we perceive, is that there's a fair amount of work to take the reference code we deliver and in some sense integrate that into the tree that you'll be using for a particular product. And we want to find that integration work and reduce it to the minimum amount possible, because every one of the companies that does that integration work is doing the same thing, the integration, doing it all a little differently. How does that generate value for the ecosystem as a whole, right? It seems like duplication to me. So we're looking for things like that to reduce it. The other thing about right sizing here is that for our business anyway, we're on record as telling everybody that the big growth spaces that are available to us, we believe, right, the expansion of TAM that our CEO has talked about, big chunks of that are out in the cloud service provider server style market segments, and big chunks of it are out in the IoT, right? Things on the end of the wire, on the end of those interesting 5G networks. When you look at those markets where Intel is not necessarily the dominant incumbent, especially in IoT spaces, the model of doing firmware initialization out there is completely different, right? Code comes from your silicon provider as freely available. It's part of the cost of doing business. There's a lot of self-enabling on the part of companies that participate in that ecosystem. If you look at, when I get feedback from the companies that operate in those kinds of spaces, want to use IA? Here's this Tiano core thing, right? And it's this giant elephant, right? They have to get their head around the build system and all the exciting tree content that we have that's very rich in feature terms. But for the kinds of platforms we're talking about, right, a lot more work than you really need to understand in order to be able to get the pieces that you need. So we're pacing like a big step function in terms of people's ability to learn how to use that code base. So again, going forward, we want to find different ways to present the entry to this collateral space. I'm not talking about getting rid of it. I'm not talking about completely changing it or rewriting it from scratch. But if you're an IoT, you're the one software guy in a company of 20 people and you've got to figure out a way to initialize the IA part in the middle of that machine, we want to find you a way that's reasonably assimilatable in your lifetime, right? And preferably the lifetime of that product, to approach the code and get the assets that you need and figure out a way to screw them together and get onto the fun part, which is actually building the value add code that you get paid for in that runtime environment on the device. Okay, so in service of that, I very often get the feedback that Tiano Core is an Intel project that happens to have open source licensing. What I would like to get to in the future is that people have the perception that this is an open source project of which has as one of its contributors, Intel as a member of that community. So we're going to learn by doing, right? So I'm not going to promise you that we're going to be perfect at role modeling best practices in open source day one, but we're committed to figure out what that looks like as far as the community is concerned. And that'll be some very different behaviors that I hope you will see from us soon with respect to how we interact with the community. So we want to get into the business of sharing design information much earlier. We've already started having, there's an 800 number you can call in, right? We're having design review meetings on things that we're doing that are open to anybody. we're going to start building code in the open source from day one. Today's model, we typically have developers inside of Intel that are working on code that is destined for the open source, and it might be, I don't know, depends on the feature, months of development time that happens sort of behind closed doors. We get to the point where the thing is fully validated, we have reasonable confidence in that code, and then poof, overnight we get this monster check-in of a new feature, right? And oftentimes we get this, wait, we didn't know that was coming, right? And very occasionally I get, wait, what do you mean you're working on X? We were already working on X too, right? Again, back to the efficiency thing in the ecosystem. That's not a very good way to do it. So for things that are destined to end up in the open source world, you should see us in future starting to check in line one of code on day one into the open source repos. That is our objective. It'll take us a while to figure out how to do that, and we've got to re-educate some of our internal population to do it, but that is our objective. You will see us put more collateral into the open source content as well. We've been slowly increasing the amount of open source collateral that we have over the years. The pace of that change will probably accelerate from this point forward. There's kind of an interesting juxtaposition there, because the other thing that we've got to be careful of is, obviously there's this period of time that we would be developing an enabling code for something that's going to show up in silicon that is as yet unreleased to the marketplace. So while I say we're going to do line one, day one for things in open source, for the stuff that's related very specifically to products that are unannounced, we're probably going to end up with an embargo period where there will be some enabling work, and you'll see it pop out in open source form, but maybe a little later than the day one start. So how we figure out which thing is in which category, there's lots of debate about going on there, but I hope I give you the sense of the fact that we're trying to frame the work that we're doing in those cases. There is also going to be stuff, probably at least for the foreseeable future, that will remain its proprietary code now, and it will be tomorrow as well. My goal personally is to reduce that set to the minimum size as quickly as possible. We'll see how successful we can be at that. We also want to increase or do a better job with open source process in general. So for those of you that are watching the mailing list, the stewards are having conversations about process things. Microsoft talked, I think it was yesterday, right? You got up and talked about Mu. There are some things about Mu from a tools, code structure, process point of view that I think generally most people who are working on the EDK2 code base regularly will say, yep, that's better than what we have today. Exactly what form an eventual formulation of what better tools, better process, and better structure look like, we're still working out some of the exact nuts and bolts in there, but part of having a single organization at Intel gives me the ability to leverage that organization into doing real work here to make that kind of a structural change. And that institutional memory will get less powerful over time, right? So I want to use the fact that we've just changed the organization inside of Intel to think about change right now. So there's big emphasis on trying to figure out what that looks like. So if you have strong views about that, by the way, we'd like to hear about it. So again, more community oriented. I don't want this to be something that Intel thinks about and we tell you, okay, fait accompli, this is what we've decided. You guys are all going to see the new version of how life is. We want that to be more of a discussion for the community's betterment. Okay, shifting back to code first. For those of you that have worked on this, well, I think I get to be able to claim that I'm the very first person that ever worked on EFI. So I've been around and doing this quite a while, but for those of you that remember back to EFI before UEFI, our approach was led by code, right? We built a so-called sample implementation, and the specification was documented based on that. When Andrew, Mike Kinney, and others had finished the code to the point that it was actually functional. With the formation of the UEFI forum, we sort of drifted to a model where the specifications led, and then code could come out once the specification for the interfaces that read on that code was published. For Intel's purposes now, again, for things that are destined to be in the open source domain, once they are finished, our intention is to go back to this idea of code first. And this goes back to the day one, line one, getting into the public repos. With the change to the license that I'll talk about in a minute, we believe that it is practical to do the work on the code, get that settled to the satisfaction of the community working on it, and then derive interface definitions from that and put them into the spec. And the thought here is that today we get a lot of complaint from the open source community that when you make an ECR proposal for a change, it takes a long time for that to sort of go through this veil of Intel confidentiality and pop out the other side. The thought is here, if we wait to submit the ECRs, making them UEFI confidential, to kind of the last minute, right? Occasionally, the work group chair pops up and says, any last proposals before we call this thing closed, right? That would be the moment at which proposals based on community-driven code development would get inserted into the spec processing train. So we hope to keep the blackout window as short as possible. And we think we'll get more community participation in pathfinding as a result of that. The other thing that we've done with the Intel organization is to change the mindset on licensing for code in general. I keep saying things destined for the open source. It's not 100% of everything. Our mindset now is open as the default. So when we start specifying a new project, right, the business group that owns the technology that we're working on has to argue the case for having it be closed, or it is open by default. So again, that's sort of in service of our idea of trying to get to a greater amount of open source code collateral over time. Okay, let me talk about the licensing, and I'm going to talk about this as a sort of an example of trying to be more community oriented. The license we have was originally derived, I think, I tried to do the memory sum here. I couldn't find any actual documentation. I think it was around about 2002, 2003 kind of time frame that we came up for this. I've told many people over the years that if I had it to do over again, I would have picked Apache 2.0 as the license for this. That didn't exist in those days, right? That predates Apache 2.0. I think Apache 1.0 was out, but it didn't have the patent protection thing in it. But if you look at it today, there's a better alternative still. We alighted on this idea of BSD 2-clause plus patent. It's more permissive than the existing formulation. The contributor agreement goes away, so there's no hurdle there in terms of having to figure out whether you can sign up to a contributor agreement at all. But it's a nice balance between permissive open source and still allowing the commercial entities that want to work on the code base the opportunity to do whatever they want with derivatives, right? Shorthand version is it doesn't have the entanglements that copyleft formulations would have for commercial entities. But it still gives you protection for IP considerations. In other words, it's safe to use the code, right? You're not going to have third-party companies come after you for infringement requests because of the way the license works. So it's pretty simple. It's an approved osi.org. You can go look it up on the website there. It's an approved formulation. Most legal departments around the industry have looked at all the OSI licenses and signed off them ahead of time. So generally speaking, we think it should be easier for people coming to the project first time to get in and participate there. It adds a level of compatibility with people that want to use the code in the context of VPL v2 projects that we did not have before. So again, more permissive than before. And the reason I'm talking about all of this as a very limited, sort of narrow thing that we're doing is to try and point out the process. We used an RFC process in the community that Stefano ran for us. And we tried to make sure that we were listening right. I did originally propose that we should use Apache 2. And there was a collection of feedback that in some came back and said to us, hey, there's a better alternative. So we took that on board, we took it seriously and went back and revisited the original proposal and modified that to this lighter weight formulation. And it is my hope that when we come to talk about more complicated things than just the licensing, back to the tools and processes and code structure items that we have on deck for that community to work on next maybe, my hope is that you'll see us be equally flexible about Intel's position on some of those things, and we'll be just one voice in the community, and the result that we come to will be something that the community can feel comfortable with. So in the spirit of getting out of the way quickly, this is the point at which I'm going to hand over to Stefano. He's going to talk about what we think some of the community needs to look like going forward, and My big plea to all of you is think about what he's going to say, think about how well it works for you, and please bring us the feedback, right? Bring the community the feedback. Let's have the discussion. All right, let me get out of the way.
All right, hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, booming sound, excellent. So thank you all for having me here today. This is my first UEFI Plugfest. It's been a lot of fun, and I've been kept very busy, so that's good. Also, I just wanted to mention that Mark was putting on his Intel hat. I'm actually going to be taking my Intel hat off. So I'm going to be talking as the community manager for Tiano Core. And it's really important that I stress that that means I'm going to be concentrating on my community involvement and not on my role at Intel. That's completely separate. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means, what I see as community management, what I see the Tiano Core community becoming, and where we hope to go with it. So first, oops, there we go. Going the correct direction is important. All right. So first off, our open source ethos, I'd like to talk about some of the core principles that we're going to espouse and the things that we're going to try to accomplish because of those values. So transparent decision making is probably top on the list. So we're really lucky to have 4 stewards on the Tiano Core project, and they range from different companies, but they've all done a really great job at helping me come up to speed quickly and also in listening to community requests. And having this kind of strong leadership is key to any open source project. And the reason it's important is because in order to drive a community, you need to be sure that the community interests trump all else. The community interests have to come first. So in that structure where you have a community giving feedback, you need to have strong leadership there, people with years of experience who can guide that community in the right direction. And like I said, we're lucky in that all the people from Red Hat and Linaro to Apple and Intel all have years of experience working in UEFI. And so they can really espouse the best values and show the best path forward. One of our goals, and probably the one that I'm working the hardest on, is to do all things in the open. And like Mark just said, this is a struggle. I work for Intel, and this code all started closed source. So when I go to open source conferences like SUSECon, where I was just at, and FOSDEM, which is definitely a big open source conference, I have to remind people that this code and all of this process started behind closed doors. Most open source projects that you see out there today, line 1 of code was in open source. And that makes things really easy for that project compared to trying to take years of work and drag it out into the open. And the key is that we need to make sure that we do all aspects of that design in the open. So I'm from Intel, so I have to use an acronym or some alliterative term. So I decided on alliteration. And so I'm talking about discussing, designing, developing, and debugging in the open. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means. First off, and I think I've made some headway here in terms of discussion. We're trying to do more of our discussion in the open. So we have mailing lists. I've moved those over to groups.io, which is just a place where we can communicate easier than the way we did before. I'm trying to encourage open discussion with community meetings that we hold monthly. So on the first Thursday of every month, and I'll be talking more about how you can participate in that, we get together and just talk about community progress, community issues, what people would like to see move forward. And likewise, we've started design meetings. So one of the things I'm trying to change at Intel, and one of the things that I'd like to see change in all our communities, is really to take those designs that we're thinking about adding to our products and to get those open source as soon as possible. Open sourcing early in any discipline means you're going to gain the feedback right at the beginning of your project, rather than at the end. It's really easy for people to look at your project after it's done and point out all the mistakes you made. But it's much better if you can start that all off in the open and get that feedback right away. Now, there's a lot of work still left to be done in both these, but I feel like we've made some progress. One place where I think we can make a lot of progress is doing development and debugging in the open. Now, I've already talked to quite a few of you about this, and the term CI, continuous integration, has come up a few times. So today, as things stand, we do have all of our issue tracking in Bugzilla. As I mentioned, we do have design meetings in the open. Our code is hosted on GitHub. But we'd really like to look at the whole flow of this system And using the open source meetings or the open community meetings that we have going, we'd like to take the whole process and look at it from a community standpoint and say, what is the best for everyone? Every company is going to do this thing different, from submitting a bug or a feature request, to working on the code, to reviewing that code, and finally to doing some continuous integration on that code. But if we can come together as a community and decide what is a system that works for all of us, or at least gets as close as it can to working for all of us, we can all benefit from that. And I think CI is the easiest thing to point out there. If we can all do CI in the open and put our use cases out there, then when the EDK2 does a release, we can show what the validation looks like. What does that release actually mean? It means these things have been validated. And that leans in a little bit to what Mark talked about in terms of a code-first mentality. We have actually one of our community members here, Raphael, who's going to be talking to you tomorrow, and he's going to be talking to you about a really interesting project that he did in enabling accessibility options in firmware. So for people who are visually impaired, the audio capabilities of firmware, the lack of those audio capabilities is a real hindrance. If I want to work on firmware, or if I even want to just interact with firmware, something that most of us in the room take for granted, becomes very difficult. So his community efforts are a great example of where we'd like to take these things that are being worked on, show it to the community, show the benefits that are inherent there, and hopefully get lots of feedback so that we can then, as a group, work on these really interesting features, and if those features merit it, be turned into standards. So I'd like to take a break from talking a little bit about what we're working on and talk a little bit more about a higher level idea of what is good open source community management and driving community. I'm going to take a lot of these ideas. I don't know if any of you know John O'Bacon, but he's pretty much written the book on open source community management. The book is called The Art of Community, so I highly recommend you go read it. But a lot of these ideas are going to come from ideas that he espouses and he's talked about in his book. So I like to introduce myself as the community manager for TianoCore. So what does that mean? When I say I'm doing community management, what am I striving to do? And I've come up with these 3 ideas that are really at the heart of it. First off, keeping your eyes on the long view. It's really easy to get caught up on how our line endings look and how many columns should be in our code. But knowing where the TianoCore community goes in the next 3 to 5 years and how that looks is really what I want to focus on. Because in the end, projects that last, projects that become long-term projects have to know what's happening in that time frame. And they have to have community agreement on where that's going. So how do you do that? You clearly define strategic goals. Those goals are informed by the community, and you have to deliver those goals on a predictable cadence. And as we all know from firmware and software development, predictable cadences never slip. Things always get released right on time. But even if they can't be released on time, the idea is that you set those goals and you try to meet those as often as possible. And that gives, just like in software or firmware development, that kind of cadence lends credence to your project and shows that you're serious. Because it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about CI. But if I can't come back to you next year and talk about all the efforts that have been done and what has been accomplished in terms of open community CI, then I'm really not driving the community forward. And finally, rigorous communication. So it's funny. Very often, the first thing that I get from leadership, especially at Intel, but just in general, when I talk about making a decision is, hey, let's poll the community. And don't get me wrong. Polling works really well for some instances. If you need to change the time of your bug triage, poll the community and they'll tell you what a good time frame is for people. However, as we're learning, perhaps painfully today in our society, when people are polled in a community, they often make rash decisions. And those rash decisions can have long-term consequences. So it's really important that you engage in conversation, because conversation is where you can get at the heart of what the community is looking for. Rather than just simply asking them for a yes or no, you ask them to explain their position, and the community can then react to those ideas and discuss it in the open. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of mistakes. I'm going to try to keep this at 5 minutes so we can still have time for questions. But there's a few community mistakes that Jono has talked about that I think are very pertinent to this community, and I'd like to avoid them. And so in hoping to avoid them, I'm going to talk about them and ways we could possibly work around them. First thing, there's no such thing as one-sided value. Community value always wins. So In having community meetings every month and in coming to design meetings and putting forward your ideas, the features you'd like to see, you come away with a sense of what the community sees as the benefit. Now, that doesn't mean that if the community doesn't see a benefit for them, they're not going to put that idea forward, but rather we want to find things that all of the community can agree has value. And if the community can agree that it has value, then that's the thing you move forward with. Another thing that's really important to me in moving this forward is having an end-to-end strategy. So I talked a little bit about that from a code standpoint. But from a community standpoint, having an end-to-end solution means everything from someone's interest in the project to their participation over to their mentoring and their ability to work on the project they're working on with people who have been doing this for years, guiding them, to finally rewarding them for participating in that community. That process allows newcomers to form a long-term relationship with your project. And that's the sort of things that gives longevity to open source communities. So those are things that I'm really hoping to work on in the coming months. And speaking of me working on things, community management is hands-on. It really is my job to go out there and espouse these ideas and to know my community. So this is kind of the point where I ask all of you to join us. The first Thursday of every month, we have a community meeting, and I take lots of notes on that and post them online, and there's a mailing list that you can bring your ideas to, so there are lots of ways to participate. I've already mentioned the new design meetings that we have. Those are held bi-monthly. So getting you guys out to come out to these meetings and to work with me, I can then take those ideas to the stewards and we can broaden our relationship. So a few other common mistakes, and this one is perhaps something I struggle with on a daily basis. Community is really a company culture. And this is something that I go back to and I work with every day at Intel, but I hope that you go back to and work at with your company. And that's the fact that everyone at the company has to be involved in open source. In this community, you have to have everyone agreeing from leadership all the way down to the coder. Everyone has to know, here are the tenets, here's how it works, and there can't be any ambiguous points anywhere in your leadership chain all the way down to the people working on the code. The example I like to use is there's no such thing as us and them. No one dictates in a community. There is no person who can come in and say, this is how we're going to do things. Instead, we have stewards that lead a community, and that community informs those stewards. That concept is vital, and you need to go back to your leadership and explain that to them so that they know how we work as a community. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, it's really easy to trip over know-it-all syndrome. Ask anyone who's worked in an industry for 20 to 30 years, and they'll tell you they still don't know everything. There's lots that we can learn. And the beauty of the community and the beauty of these meetings and these opportunities is that we can come together and learn as a group. We all know there's no use in going off into your silo and doing it on your own when you can bring it out to the community and let everyone work on it. The efforts of the many make things so much easier that the value is inherent. It's really obvious. So with that, I'd like to do my necessary plug for the things I've been talking about and talk about how you can join the conversation. So as I mentioned, there's two mailing lists that we formed. The development mailing list where we do our patch review, and then the announcement mailing list where we can talk about things that are going on in the community. There's bi-monthly meetings for bug triage and for designs. So I really I implore you guys to go back and talk to your teams. If there's a design you're working on that you think can be open sourced, go talk to your legal department. If it can be open sourced, talk to me. We'll get that design scheduled in one of our design meetings, and we'll have lots of people from this industry who have been doing this for years come help you look at the thing you're trying to do. And perhaps most importantly, the community meetings. These happen once a month on the first Thursday, and we've had really good attendance with them, and I'm really hoping to get all of you out to it. I think the more people we have there, the more opinions that can be shared, and the easier all of our jobs will become if we're able to talk about things in the open. So with that, thank you guys all for having me here, and I'll open the door up to any questions you had on any of that stuff.
This was very UEFI focused.
Yeah.
The blackout period stuff, like for us, it's a huge problem on ACPI. Much more, well, not much more, about the same, I guess. So what are your thoughts there? Because I mean,
So when I said UEFI Forum, I meant everything that the UEFI Forum has under its wing. So ACPI specs would definitely be included there.
Okay.
More or less anything that falls into this firmware space. I mean, we've talked about, I forget who was asking me first this morning, but we had a conversation with some of the board members about the Intel FSP spec and whether we should maybe bring that into the forum as a thing. So that would apply, same thing there as well, for example. I don't think we've open sourced everything for an FSP just yet, but we're about to. So that tells you there's nothing in there that we think is magical secret source, so it would behave just the same way. So yeah, ACPI, absolutely, if we're putting new things together there. And we can do something that's a code-first approach, right? I mean, there are things in ACPI that we do that are very platform-specific that would fall under the embargo because it's unreleased product. Obviously, I can't do very much with that. But for things that are destined to be part of the open content, absolutely, that would be just everything under UEFI forum's aegis. So we've got at least 2 down here and 1 over there too.
Also a plug for the announcement mailing list. Any of that stuff that does get open sourced will be on the announcement mailing list. So another reason to sign up.
In most of the open source community, CI is most important process, right? Do you have any thoughts on CI for UEFI?
I'll actually take part of that. So yeah, a lot of the things that I'm discussing with the stewards now around CI revolve around how do we start moving it forward. So at some of these design meetings, one of the things that I plan on doing is saying, all right, we've got our system worked out that we've been working on. We're going to find a way that we can get an end-to-end coding solution in the open that works for everything from submitting the patch all the way through to reviewing it and then finally CI. And then finding who in the community can come together and help us build that CI. Because really what's vital for us, as so often is the case, is resources. We need people who can come help us. I only have so many hours in my day to commit to spinning up a CI system. So the more resources that we can get, the better. So yeah, look forward to some design meetings where we discuss just that and how we can do that moving forward. And perhaps most importantly, how we can open source the use cases and the test cases so that when people see that something is being validated, it's the things that all of you guys care about, because that's what we need to validate.
Right, yeah, I mean, I was going to tee off the validation thought. I didn't say very much about validation on the way past in the remarks that I made, but one thing I observe is that Intel does a whole bunch of testing internally. So we have a whole slew of test collaterals, and oh, by the way, a ton of results that today we don't share, but we're gonna. Both the actual test material and the results. We've got to figure out a way to do that without burying you in reams and reams of meaningless test result data. But our intention is to make more of that available. We do a daily build in the lab in China. I think it's in Shanghai that we do this. Pull the code every night, build it on half a dozen reference platforms that we have, ship out images to those reference platforms. They run an automated test set, and every morning we get the result back, did the code base regress or not. That is today an Intel-only process. I'm really interested in figuring out, back to that friction comment I made earlier, right? Reducing friction in the ecosystem. I'd be really interested in figuring out a way to get systems beyond the reference platforms into that loop, which would imply that we understand how to do quick integration of the code that Intel's producing, the reference code and the core code, and have a way to figure out distributing versions of that code, getting it integrated with OEM-specific platforms and running test payloads on those at the same kind of cadence we do. Maybe it's not practical to do that on a daily basis with all of you, but maybe we could get somewhat closer to that than we do today, which is not at all. So there's a whole slew of conversations around continuous integration, which is required to even contemplate that next step of getting the value of shared validation work to help us all speed up. So we want to go all the way through that process to the end. 2 more questions down here. We're gonna get you fit today, Harry, running backwards and forwards. Yeah, Sama had a question. And
Hi. Yeah, you had talked about how you're going to try to open source as much as possible, but some things won't be. Could you give some examples of like things that are currently closed source that might be open sourced, or alternatively things that probably never will be?
Well, I alluded to FSP, for example, right? FSP today typically includes memory initialization code. For certain platforms, we're going to be able to provide 100% of that in source form. And I expect by the time we reach the end of 2019, we'll have at least one significant product line that does business that way. So there's an example of something that is today typically closed source that will migrate more towards open. But it's not 100% of all the platforms that we're going to do that with. I suppose the canonical example of things that will never be, right, the microcode and some of the ACMs, for example, that are security related and tied to the internals of our processor design, you know, we're probably not going to open those kinds of things up because they're part of the physical hardware, essentially. They're soft components of those physical parts. So those would probably be my two examples. Does that kind of give you the flavor?
So Mark, you talked about the code-first approach and getting it out in the community, the design, the development, and pushing the PCR into the spec in the last minute, which makes perfect sense if it started in the community.
Okay, I thought you were going to tell me it was a terrible idea. I was like, oh.
No, so my question is, what about the opposite? When the change starts as an ECR within UEFI forum, right, and it gets approved as an ECR, is there any thinking of making that available to the community before the spec is published? Because otherwise you're going to have a long delay.
With apologies to those that have been through this debate already, let me rehash some of the things that we talked about in previous years. We looked at the same kind of, I forget the exact, is it ECN or DCN? There's a process that the PCI SIG uses.
Yeah,
to
PCI SIG publishes their
right,
approvals, and DMTF does that as well.
Long story short, if you go read the way the UEFI forum constitution reads, we have no practical way to instantiate that mechanism without rewriting the constitution to make it possible. And today that would require, wait for it, 13 legal departments to sign off on a constitutional change. And oh, by the way, if we open the thing up, the chances of that group of lawyers not saying, oh, but could we please just add this, you know, right, will never get done. So we've backed away from that. So as a practical matter, I've just told you that Intel is thinking about switching its approach to code first with a view to minimizing this window of blackout that we have necessarily with the way the UEFI constitution is written. I would like to encourage everybody else to think about maybe doing the same thing, right? Take advantage of the fact that we have Stefano. He can do some legwork in getting design reviews set up and getting, you know, people familiar with how to bring code into the open source project. Take advantage of that, and let's all work on, you know, maybe it would be appropriate for us all to work on things that, again, not stuff that's specific to your product, but things that you want to instantiate that are destined for open source residency, right? The project about accessibility is a great example. There's nothing particularly platform specific about that or product specific perhaps, but it's a feature that everybody could benefit from. There's a perfect candidate where don't write the ECR first, let's work on the code, let's figure out what we need, get it stable, run it through whatever CI process we come up with, right? Get it to the point where we think it's quote unquote ready, and then we can codify the interface to make sure that it doesn't, you know, wander over time in a way that breaks compatibility, which is really the value we get out of the specs. I have reasonable amount of influence over what Intel does in that respect. I'd like to encourage you guys to think about taking the same approach, but obviously, you know, you'll have to evaluate how sensible that is for each of your own company's objectives and needs. Any other questions? Zach told me we could have the whole of his time because he's not in a hurry to get up and talk, so we could go on for hours or get out of the way and let him talk. Up to you guys. And I'll be around for the rest of the day. Stefan will be here today and tomorrow, I think, as well, right? So if you want to come find us afterwards and ask more questions that weren't appropriate for the broad audience, have at it. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.